Each of us are a story woven from the people, places, and moments that have shaped who we are and how we perceive the world around us. My story begins in the prairies, where the sky is an endless blue and the yellow wheat fields go on for as far as your eye can see. My story walks paths, enters moss-covered forests, and sits beneath cathedrals of ancient trees. It labors through snow, swims in cool lakes, turns over discarded bits of bark, collects stones, and bends to look closely at the small and exquisite wonders that surround us in the natural world. It is also a story of watching those whom you love disappear before you, in pain and suffering, yet with profound courage and strength. When I look back to consider where it all began, who I am and how I came to think, move, and make in this world with grief as my steady companion, I'm brought back to a quiet winter morning in November of 1990. The ground was frozen and the sky was clear. This is the day my sister died. I was 10 years old. I learned then that losing is a part of loving, that loss is always near, and that grief changes us and stays with us. I learned how to carry it, how to live on with it. I learned what it means to live with the presence of absence. Grief is not something that we move past. Rather, we move with it. Like a current, we can step into its flow and be taken somewhere new. As an artist, I make work that explores relationships, the experience of loss, and how nature can give us new ways to perceive death. I have come to understand that art making is a way to express the complex and often abstract nature of grief, while creating new spaces to deal with death. It creates a space to locate grief in our own bodies, to acknowledge loss, and to remember. My love of the natural environment and my interest in grief first converged in my art practice many years ago when I was exploring issues of environmental degradation caused by industrial resource extraction. At the time, I was researching mining and learning about its devastating effect on fragile ecological networks and migration patterns. In response, I created this series entitled Migrations of Loss. I described this body of work as a poetic lamentation I felt over these wounded ecologies. The focus of my practice shifted, however, after losing 3 loved ones in 2018. In the spring, my grandmother passed away. Then in the fall, one of my high school art students died. And then that winter, right after Christmas, my dog also passed. All 3 succumbed to cancer. It was then that I began to consider our bodies as a wounded ecology when changed by illness, and our relationships a type of ecological network that also need healing once we experience a death. Thinking with grief and thinking with and through nature became a part of my methodology for making. Through time in nature and in the studio, I came to create large-scale installations as public places for contemplating the fragility of our body, death, and our intrinsic connections to one another and to the natural world. After experiencing those 3 deaths, I found myself compelled to go into nature. I was overwhelmed by my grief, but somehow the forest was a place that I could find peace. Nature, it seemed, held the key to help me process my grief, while at the same time revealing a visual language to express it. I spent a lot of time staring into darkened tree hollows and observing things in a state of decay. I also started collecting things, bits of bark, lichen, seed pods. I even dragged fragments of large tree stumps back to my studio. The forms and patterns of what I collected would become a metaphoric language for grief that I would use in my art making to articulate experiences of loss, death, and eventually regeneration. The first installation I created using this metaphoric language for grief was entitled, "This Body Won't Hold You." Reminiscent of large rocks, the forms are actually thin shells with hollow black interiors. I collected wood, burned it, and ground it by hand to create charcoal that I scattered around the forms. The process of making these works was intuitive and deeply emotional. I was trying to communicate that indescribable emptiness we are left with when someone we love dies. I wanted to make a visible form for that invisible void that death creates in our lives. Making these sculptures was a way for me to wrap my arms around something when I could no longer reach out to embrace those I'd lost. While creating the sculptures to articulate absence and loss, I also began experimenting with printmaking. Drawn to the varied patterns and forms of the things I had collected outside, I felt compelled to make prints of these things, to see what kind of traces they would leave. It was in making those first relief prints, inking up those organic materials, and rubbing my hand over the delicate paper that I began to see an echo of the human body in the patterns and shapes that emerged. I started by printing the delicate scales of ponderosa pine bark. What immediately struck me was how the shapes looked like X-rays of tumors or the masses that you see in bodies. The imprints of the bark surfaced like lungs or bones. The patterns of the lichen bloomed like the lines of our circulatory system. Making print after print, I was flooded by memories of those I lost. Somehow working with these organic materials allowed me to feel close to them again. Not long after seeing those first inky lines on the paper, I knew that I wanted to turn the prints into 3D forms. I had to give these ghostly impressions bodies that could breathe again. The paper sculptures that I created from the prints mimic and borrow the language and processes from nature, tracing the lines of time, layering, and shedding. I called this installation Tracing Your Ghost 2. When installed, the bodily forms hang and are reminiscent of pods or empty cocoons. The bodies are made from several relief prints, all torn and patched together. Peering inside the forms reveals the ponderosa pine prints, dark masses that gather and spread along the cavity walls. The pods are suspended from the ceiling, where they turn quietly on their own, spinning more quickly as people move near them. This interaction reminds me of how we carry our ghosts with us, and the way that sometimes memories can come alive at unexpected times as we move throughout our lives. The sculptures in This Body Won't Hold You and Tracing Your Ghost 2 are my attempt at reanimating the body, creating new forms that I can tend to, embrace, and abide with. One theorist who has deeply influenced my practice is feminist scholar and author Donna Haraway. It was through Haraway that I was first introduced to this notion of being a speaker for the dead in times of loss and extinction. Haraway defines someone who's a speaker for the dead as a person who helps others come to terms with death, encouraging them to use their loss as a type of refugia for moving forward in life. The word refugia has two definitions. First, it refers to a place of sanctuary. I see nature, the studio, and the gallery as offering this type of liminal space. Second, refugia refers to humus, that lively matter created through decomposition. Refugia, then, can be understood as a type of compost for nourishing new life. Through my art, I become a speaker for the dead and use the concept of death as refugia to take grief, vulnerability, and loss and transform them into something hopeful and new. Grief is not just a series of emotional stages that we go through that comes to an eventual end. Rather, grief is transformational and enduring. We live on with it. Grief causes us to think and approach the world in new ways. Thinking with grief in my practice allows me to lean into this transformation as a productive artistic response, to create installations that engender empathy for one another, while creating spaces that offer new modes of memory and memorial. Transformation, regeneration, and hope have become the focus of my more recent artworks, including this installation entitled "Listen Now to the Quickening of Ghosts Who Whisper, Rebuild, Rebuild." As humans, we are intrinsically connected to nature. We are a part of it. Nature, therefore, can teach us how to perceive death as not just a loss or an end, but as a regenerative process whereby new life can be nourished. Life forges on, no matter what detrimental losses have occurred. For me, this is both surreal and hopeful. One question I explore while making my art is what processes happen in nature. Nests are created through the collection of detritus. By repeatedly layering bits of organic and inorganic material, birds and animals make new cohesive forms that are life-giving and sustaining. Nothing is ever wasted in nature. All death becomes material for which to rebuild. This installation was a study in the material process of nest building, the concept of using death as refugia, and the creative action of making new. These sculptures were inspired by super wasp nests. These particular nests aren't just used one year, they actually are built on over and over again. Scientists speculate it might be due to climate change. I find this both terrifying and beautiful. To me, these nests speak of the resilience of animate life in the natural environment to forge on. Nests go through cycles of life and death, from fullness to emptiness. For me, this signifies the tensions of life with death and the potential of transforming materials and loss into something life-giving and generative. I created these sculptures by first making the form and then tearing and layering hundreds of relief prints of fragmented tree stumps, bark, and lichen. In the installation, the largest of the work looms above the viewers, where they can peer into the black voids. The smaller sculptures are meant to give the sense of a new colony being built, the spread of activity and new life. Listen now to the quickening of ghosts who whisper, rebuild, rebuild, explores what it looks like to actively grieve, to go on living with death. It enacts the hopeful potential of mourning while making new. While creating these artworks has been a very personal journey through grief, what I find deeply meaningful is that the installations also are an invitation for others to share their own stories of loss and death. The sense of shared fragility is woven into the works. I see the intimate conversations that arise due to the installations as part of the regenerative and hopeful potential of the artworks, that we can strengthen our bonds to one another and to nature and find comfort and hope while sharing common suffering. Like the interconnected roots of trees that send nutrients and support to those in need, we too are an ecosystem that need to reach out to each other in times of grief to create a network of empathy, strength, and care. The transformative quality of nature and art is that they offer us new ways to perceive and respond to death, allowing us to move forward without those we've lost, while still finding ways to honor their ghosts. Thank you.